March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden, the fight of the century, Ali versus Frazier. In the front row, closer to the violence than senators and movie stars, sits a man in a coat worth $125,000, pure chinchilla, custom-made, untouchable. His name is Frank Lucas. In his pocket, keys to a heroin empire generating 1 million per day. In his veins, the absolute certainty that he is the king of Harlem. In his mouth, a lie so perfect it will fool the world for 50 years. A modest apartment in Philadelphia. An elderly woman sits across from a tape recorder, her hands folded, her voice steady as steel. Frank Lucas, she says, was a driver. Not a king, not a right hand, a driver. Her name is Bumpy Johnson. She buried the real king of Harlem in 1968. She slept next to Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson for decades, watched him build an empire on respect and silence, saw him die clutching his chest in a restaurant on 125th Street. And when Hollywood turned Frank Lucas into Denzel Washington, when they made him immortal in American Gangster, when they crowned him the heir to Bumpy's throne, she watched her husband's legacy get stolen by a man who held the steering wheel, never the power. Frank Lucas claims he was Bumpy's prot, the chosen son, the student who learned at the master's feet and built a 52 million heroin operation on those teachings. He says Bumpy died in his arms, whispering final instructions. He says he revolutionized the drug trade by flying pure heroin in the coffins of dead American soldiers. Bumpy Johnson says Frank Lucas is a liar. She says he drove the car, carried bags, waited outside while real decisions were made. She says when Bumpy collapsed at Wells' restaurant, Frank wasn't even in the room. One of them is lying, and the truth will destroy everything. Because if Frank Lucas was never Bumpy's right hand, then every dollar of his empire was built on a stolen name. Every interview was fraud. Every scene in American Gangster was propaganda for a con man who turned prison time into Hollywood gold. But if Bumpy Johnson is protecting a dead man's reputation, if she can't admit that her husband's real successor wasn't family, but the hungry kid from North Carolina who understood the one lesson Bumpy actually taught him, the loud man dies. The silent man lives. But the liar becomes a legend. Right now you have to choose. Do you believe the man who sold 98% pure poison to build a myth? Or do you believe the woman who watched the real king die and refuses to let his throne be stolen by a chauffeur with a movie deal? Stay until the end if you want the truth about what Frank Lucas really was, right-hand man, or just a driver who rewrote history one lie at a time. Harlem, early 1960s. Neon buzzes over 125th Street like a broken crown. The Apollo glows. Smoke curls out of Small's paradise. Street vendors shout prices over distant car horns. But underneath all that noise lives a different kind of silence. A disciplined silence. A silence with a name and a throne. Bumpy Johnson. You don't see him at first. You feel him. A table goes quiet. A dice game pauses mid-roll. A bartender straightens his tie for no reason he can explain. Then he appears in the doorway of Small's paradise, hat low, trench coat smooth, folded newspaper under his arm like a scepter. He doesn't flash money. He doesn't flash guns. He doesn't need to. The Italians control the docks. The corrupt police control the badges. But in Harlem, Bumpy controls the one thing money can't buy, respect. Invisible, but absolute. This is not a cartoon gangster. This is a philosopher king who understands that the most dangerous weapon in the underworld isn't a pistol. It's silence. He moves through Small's paradise like a shadow with gravity. Men lean in to hear a whisper. A raised eyebrow sends a runner to the payphone. A nod settles a feud that could have killed 6 people by sunrise. One man. One mind. One invisible empire built on something the 5 families downtown will never understand. The loyalty of the streets. And outside, on the curb under that dripping neon, a skinny kid from North Carolina waits with his hands on the steering wheel. Frank Lucas. He's not a king. Not yet. He's not even a knight. He's the driver, one of several. An engine key with a pulse. A pair of eyes in the rearview mirror, watching power he can't touch. Frank came north with nothing but hunger. Real hunger. The kind you get when you watch white men burn crosses on your lawn and realize the law is never going to protect you. North Carolina gave him fear. Harlem offers him something else. Possibility. But possibility and power are separated by more than just time. They're separated by respect, and respect can't be stolen. It has to be earned. The meeting between Frank and Bumpy happens sometime in the early 1950s. In Frank's version, told decades later to cameras and journalists, it's destiny. The young lion meeting the old king, recognition passing between them like electricity. Bumpy sees something special in Frank's eyes, something worth cultivating. In this version, Bumpy takes Frank under his wing immediately, begins teaching him the rules of power, transforms him from street hustler into criminal philosopher. But step inside Small's paradise on any given night, and the reality looks different. Bumpy sits in the back corner booth at exactly 3 o'clock every afternoon, conducting the business of an empire without raising his voice above a whisper. At that table sit men like Junie Byard and Finley Hoskins, the real lieutenants, the actual inner circle. When Bumpy leans in to discuss territory and strategy, these are the faces across from him. Their opinions matter. Their loyalty has been tested by blood and time. Who's the country boy? Someone asks once, eyes flicking toward the street where Frank waits beside the Lincoln Continental. Just a driver, Junie says, not looking up from his cards. Keeps his mouth shut. That's about it. No one calls him heir. No one calls him right hand. He's another moving part in a machine that already runs perfectly. Inside the car, Frank sits with the weight of separation pressing against his chest. That partition of glass between the front and back seats isn't just a window. It's a universe. In the back seat, decisions are made that shift the economy of New York. Money moves, territories are drawn, names are made or erased. In the front seat, Frank Lucas holds the steering wheel and listens, always listening. The passenger door opens. Bumpy slides in, the weight of his presence changing the temperature. He doesn't look at Frank right away. Just exhales like a man carrying the world. Drive, Bumpy says. No hello, no small talk. Just a command. Simple, absolute. Frank pulls away from the curb like he's carrying nitroglycerin. 2 hands on the wheel, eyes straight ahead. But his ears are open. Snatches of conversation float from the back seat on different nights. Numbers, names, warnings. Bumpy on the phone with a police captain, never let them see you want it. You want the throne? Act like you already own the building. Bumpy to an underling who's gotten too loud, the visible man dies first. Remember that. Silence is survival. Frank pretends not to listen. But he absorbs every word like gospel. Every lesson is a brick. He's building something in his head, constructing a blueprint of power from stolen moments and overheard wisdom. Years later, Frank will claim this was his education, that the back seat of that Lincoln was a throne room, and he was the chosen student. That Bumpy was grooming him, shaping him, handing him keys to an empire. He'll describe private conversations where Bumpy taught him everything. Cut out the middleman, stay silent, control the product from source to street. But there's a massive difference between learning the lesson and earning the respect. Frank was studying for a test he was never invited to take. One rainy night, Frank finally speaks up. Bumpy is in the back seat, flipping through his ever-present newspaper, glasses low on his nose. Mr. Johnson, Frank says, voice tight with fear and ambition, I could do more for you. Silence. The kind that weighs a ton. Bumpy folds the paper slowly, deliberately. You could do more? He repeats like he's tasting the words for poison. Yes, sir. I see how these other guys move. They don't hustle like you do. They slip. They talk too much. I'm hungry, Mr. Johnson. Real hungry. Bumpy studies him in the rearview mirror. Those eyes are surgical. They don't just look at you. They dissect you. You know why you're still breathing, country? Bumpy says, leaning forward. Because you know how to shut up and drive. Don't confuse your lane with your destination. Frank swallows hard. But I could learn, though. Bumpy taps the back of Frank's seat with one finger. Each tap like a gavel. Lesson 1, he says. Cut out the middleman. Never pay another man to do what you can control yourself. Lesson 2. Silence. The invisible man lives the longest. Lesson 3. Product first. Money second. Respect third. In that order. You understand? Frank nods like he's being baptized. Yes, sir, good. Now shut up and drive. That moment will grow in Frank's memory like a cancer. It will stretch and evolve and transform. One day, he'll tell the world that Bumpy took him under his wing, that they had long late-night conversations about empire and legacy, that Bumpy was preparing him to inherit a throne. But ask Mame Johnson, the woman who shared Bumpy's bed and his secrets for decades, and she remembers something else entirely. Bumpy did his real business in back rooms, she says, her voice steady as steel. Private booths, closed doors, with Junie, with Finley, with real men who'd earned their seats at the table. Frank stayed with the car. Most nights he didn't even come inside. 2 versions, 1 truth, and the truth is about to die with the only man who could have settled the argument. July 7th, 1968. Wells Restaurant on 145th Street and Lenox Avenue. Fried chicken and waffles, the sacred Harlem combination. Bumpy Johnson sits at his usual table, the weight of an empire on his shoulders finally becoming too much for his 62-year-old heart to carry. It happens fast. One moment he's cutting into his chicken, the next his hand goes to his chest. The fork drops. His eyes widen. For a second, no one understands what's happening. Then, chaos erupts. Call an ambulance. Bumpy? Bumpy. Somebody help him. The king of Harlem slides out of his chair and crumples to the floor, his newspaper scattering like fallen leaves. In Frank Lucas's version, told and retold to anyone who would listen, this becomes the most important moment of his life. He claims he was there. Claims he ran to Bumpy's side, held his head, heard his last words. Claims Bumpy died in his arms, whispering final instructions, handing over an invisible crown. Take care of Harlem, Frank. Take care of my people. It's a perfect scene, cinematic, tragic, beautiful. It's also a complete lie. When you dig through the police reports from that night, when you read the witness statements, when you check the ambulance records, you find something cold and unforgiving. Frank Lucas's name isn't there. Not once. He wasn't in the restaurant. He wasn't in the room. He didn't hold the king when he fell. The man who would spend the rest of his life claiming Bumpy's legacy wasn't even present when the throne became empty. Bumpy Johnson dies on the floor of Wells Restaurant, surrounded by family and the men who actually mattered in his world. His heart gives out after a lifetime of pressure that only he truly understood. And somewhere else in Harlem, a driver feels the ground shift under his feet and makes a decision that will echo through decades. If no one will hand him a crown, he'll just write himself into the coronation story later. The king is dead. The throne is empty. And the man who wants it most has already started rewriting history, one lie at a time. When a king dies, the wolves don't mourn. They eat. Bumpy Johnson's funeral procession had barely cleared 125th Street when the vultures started circling. The Italian mafia watched from downtown Manhattan like patient predators, licking their lips at the thought of reclaiming territory they believed belonged to them by birthright. The Genovese family. The Lucchese family. They'd tolerated Bumpy because they respected his violence, but with the philosopher king dead, Harlem looked like a colony ready for reconquest. Within 48 hours, emissaries moved north with a simple message: the heroin trade now flows through Italian channels, or it doesn't flow at all. On the streets, chaos erupted like a broken hydrant. Bumpy's old lieutenants scrambled for position. Junie Bird tried to hold the center. Finley Hoskins negotiated with suppliers who suddenly wanted triple the price. Territory that was sacred under Bumpy's protection became contested ground. Guns came out. Bodies dropped. The streets that had run on respect now ran on fear and greed. Into this war zone stepped Frank Lucas. Not as an anointed heir, not as the chosen one, as a man with absolutely nothing to lose and a hunger that had been growing for years in the front seat of that Lincoln Continental. While everyone else fought over the same tired supply chains, the same Italian connections, the same corrupt cops and street corners, Frank saw a different map entirely. He remembered Bumpy's sacred lesson-like gospel: cut out the middleman. If you don't own the source, you don't own anything. So Frank made a decision that was either genius or insanity. He bought a plane ticket to a war zone. The destination was Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, where Thailand, Laos, and Burma bled into each other. It was 1968. Vietnam was consuming American lives at a rate of 300 deaths per week. The jungle was burning, and in the middle of this apocalypse, a country boy from North Carolina walked into the chaos to do business with warlords. The mathematics were intoxicating. In New York, the mafia was selling heroin stepped on and diluted until it was barely 10% pure, charging premium prices for garbage. But in Bangkok, in the back of humid bars where the air smelled of jet fuel and opportunity, you could buy a kilo of pure heroin for $4,200. That same kilo, once it hit New York streets, was worth $50,000. The profit margin wasn't just high, it was astronomical. Picture the scene Frank later described: sitting across from Thai suppliers in bamboo structures, deep in poppy country, sweat on his brow, speaking the only language that transcends culture: profit. No translator needed when discussing margins and tonnage. These men controlled fields stretching to the horizon, and they saw what Frank saw: a hungry American willing to take risks the Italians would never consider. The deal was made. Blue Magic was born. The product that hit Harlem was heroin so pure at 98% that addicts used to the mafia's 10% garbage started overdosing instantly. In the perverse logic of the drug game, the bodies were the best advertisement. If it killed you, it was the good stuff. Money poured in like a broken dam, not stacks, but laundry bags stuffed with cash. Frank was storing $584,000 in a single house, hiring family members from North Carolina just to count it. But here's where legend collides with logistics, where Frank Lucas either becomes a criminal genius or the greatest storyteller in organized crime history: the coffins. Frank's most infamous claim involves smuggling heroin inside the coffins of dead American soldiers returning from Vietnam. The story is cinematically perfect: bribing military personnel, desecrating heroes' remains, using America's grief as his smuggling route, planes full of sorrow landing at American air bases, while underneath the flags and honor bags of Blue Magic waited to poison Harlem's streets. It's the ultimate violation, so audacious and morally repugnant that Hollywood put it at the center of American Gangster. But here's the problem. Military officials and DEA investigators have called the coffin story complete fabrication. No evidence supports smuggling on the scale Frank described. The logistics don't work. The security protocols don't allow it. Yet the heroin was devastatingly real. The overdoses were real. The money was real. Whether it came in coffins or furniture crates, Frank Lucas had done the impossible. He'd bypassed the Italian mafia completely and flooded his own neighborhood with poison so pure it wiped out a generation. Frank had built an empire generating over $1 million per day. He was invisible. He was rich. He believed he was untouchable, but he had forgotten Bumpy's final lesson, the one that kept the old king alive for decades: money doesn't buy respect. Being rich is not the same as being a king. And the moment you confuse the two is the exact moment you start writing your own ending. Silence is a weapon. Noise is a target. The difference between the two is the difference between breathing and dying. Bumpy Johnson had carved this truth into the foundation of his empire. The loudest man in the room is the weakest man in the room. Not philosophy. Mathematics. If they can't see you, they can't arrest you. If they don't know your name, they can't put it on a warrant. Invisibility wasn't just survival, it was the only way to win a game where the house always holds the cards. Frank Lucas built his entire identity on being Bumpy's opposite to Nicky Barnes. He watched Barnes strut through Harlem like a peacock in a slaughterhouse, wearing suits that screamed wealth, driving cars that roared power, posing for magazine covers like fame was immunity instead of a death sentence. Barnes ended up on the New York Times Magazine with the headline Mr. Untouchable, grinning like he'd won the lottery instead of signing his own execution order. Frank positioned himself as the anti-Barnes: quiet Sundays at home with family, church when his mother demanded it, strict rules for his organization that sounded like military code: no drugs used by anyone in the crew, no flashy jewelry, no unnecessary attention. His brothers, the country boys from North Carolina, ran different territories with corporate precision. Shorty handled Brooklyn, Larry managed the Bronx. Each operation disciplined, invisible, profitable. At his peak, Frank was generating over $1 million per day in street value. Not the drugs, not the money, the respect. Blue Magic had flooded Harlem with heroin so pure that overdoses became advertisements. Bodies were business cards. If it killed you, it was the good stuff. Cash flowed in faster than it could be counted, laundry bags stuffed with bills, $584,000 hidden in a single house, his mother living like royalty in a mansion bought with poison money. Frank looked at his empire and saw permanence. Discipline. Success. He'd followed Bumpy's lessons perfectly: cut out the middleman, control the product from source to street, stay silent. 2 out of 3 wasn't bad. It was perfect. Until it wasn't. But success is a drug more addictive than Blue Magic. Money has gravity. It pulls you toward visibility even when you know better. And somewhere between the first million and the 10th, Frank Lucas started believing his own mythology. He started thinking that being rich was the same as being untouchable. March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century: Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. 15 rounds that would define a generation. Every seat was precious, every ticket a status symbol. Frank Sinatra worked the crowd with a camera. Politicians begged for access. Vice President Spiro Agnew sat surrounded by Secret Service, close enough to taste the violence. Frank could have watched from his quiet New Jersey home, counting money in the shadows while the world screamed at their televisions. Could have stayed invisible, stayed disciplined, stayed alive. Instead, he walked into Castle Furs and bought immortality for $125,000, pure chinchilla. Floor length, custom made. A coat that didn't whisper wealth, it screamed it. Matching hat. The kind of luxury that could buy a decent house with money left over. His wife touched the sleeve and felt the weight of a mistake. "You sure about this, Frank?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "This is loud." Frank smiled like a man who'd forgotten every lesson that kept him breathing. "They need to know who runs this city." In that moment, Frank Lucas chose noise over silence, chose spectacle over invisibility, chose to become exactly what Bumpy warned him never to be, the loudest man in the room. He walked into Madison Square Garden like a king stepping onto his coronation stage. Front row. Better seats than movie stars, better seats than senators, better seats than the Vice President of the United States. The cameras caught the coat. The crowd saw the coat. Every hustler in New York saw the coat. So did Detective Richie Roberts. Roberts had been chasing ghosts for years. Italian ghosts with Italian names and predictable habits. He knew what organized crime looked like. Pinky rings, greasy hair, expensive but familiar. Traditional. Documented. Photographable. What he didn't recognize was Frank Lucas, a black man in the front row wearing a coat worth more than a detective's lifetime salary, with no known businesses, no public profile, no visible explanation for sitting closer to Muhammad Ali than the most powerful men in America. Roberts nudged another detective, binoculars still trained on the fight. "Who's that?" he asked, nodding toward the chinchilla coat. The other cop shrugged. No idea. That was the problem. And the opportunity. Criminals are supposed to be in files, on lists, in photographs pinned to corkboards in smoky squad rooms. But this man in the chinchilla coat wasn't in any folder. He was a ghost who had just walked directly under a spotlight and demanded to be seen. The investigation began that night. Not because Frank committed a crime at Madison Square Garden, but because he committed the ultimate sin in the criminal underworld, he made himself visible. What followed was slow, methodical, and absolutely devastating. Federal task forces opened files. Wiretaps went up on phone lines Frank didn't even know existed. Surveillance teams parked unmarked vans outside his properties. Undercover operations began tracking his movements, his associates, his money. Financial investigators started following paper trails that led to bank accounts, real estate, legitimate businesses that weren't so legitimate. The irony was surgical in its precision. Law enforcement had been hunting Italian mobsters for decades with limited success because those families understood the value of silence and institutional protection. They had lawyers, protocols, omerta. Generations of experience in staying invisible. But Frank? Frank was new money with no infrastructure, no generational wisdom, no defense against the slow grind of federal investigation. He'd built his empire on speed and innovation, but he had no protection against patient, methodical law enforcement that didn't care about local corruption. Frank believed he was untouchable because he'd bought half the New York Police Department. Corrupt cops took his envelopes and looked the other way. Some took more than money, they took his mythology at face value. The story of the honorable gangster who only hurt those who chose the game. What Frank didn't understand was that the game had changed. A new generation of law enforcement was forming. Federal task forces that didn't answer to local precincts. Agents who couldn't be bought with cash in an envelope. Prosecutors who saw cases like his as career-making opportunities. These men didn't care about street mythology or bought cops. They cared about headlines, convictions, and the kind of high-profile cases that built reputations. While Frank sat in his Teaneck mansion counting money and thinking about legacy, federal agents were building organizational charts of his entire operation. They photographed his cars, his properties, his family members. They identified every lieutenant, every street dealer, every corrupt cop on his payroll. They mapped the veins and arteries of the Blue Magic Empire with the precision of surgeons planning an operation. Frank's organization looked permanent from the inside. His brothers ran their territories with military discipline. His mother lived in luxury, far from the North Carolina poverty that had shaped their hunger. Money flowed like water. Properties multiplied. On paper, Frank Lucas was a successful businessman. In reality, he was an insect under a microscope, every move documented, every transaction recorded, every conversation captured on federal wiretaps. The surveillance was invisible, professional, and absolutely comprehensive. Frank thought he was a king moving through his kingdom. He didn't realize he was evidence walking around in an expensive coat, every asset he'd accumulated becoming ammunition for prosecutors who were building the case that would destroy him. On quiet evenings, Frank would sit in his living room and remember Bumpy's lessons from the back seat of that Lincoln Continental. Cut out the middleman. Stay silent. Control the product from source to street. He'd followed 2 out of 3 perfectly. But that third lesson, stay silent, he'd violated completely the moment he put on that chinchilla coat and demanded the world acknowledge his existence. Bumpy had survived decades in the criminal underworld because he understood that power and visibility were inversely related. The more powerful you became, the more invisible you needed to be. Frank had inverted the equation. He'd let success make him visible, and visibility was about to cost him everything. The federal task force had identified every property, every asset, every family member. They had wiretaps, financial records, witness testimony from people Frank thought were loyal. They knew where he kept his money, where his brothers operated, which cops were dirty, how the heroin moved from Bangkok to Harlem. The case was built. The warrants were signed. The raid was scheduled. Frank Lucas was about to learn the hardest lesson in organized crime. The throne he claimed was always an illusion. Being rich is not the same as being a king, and the moment you confuse the two is the exact moment the empire starts collapsing around you. The raid was coming. Federal agents were already in position, watching his mansion, counting his cars, preparing to dismantle an empire that took years to build in a single morning. Frank Lucas, in his 125,000 chinchilla coat, had made himself the most visible target in New York. The Peacock had taken flight, and every gun in the sky was pointed at those beautiful, foolish feathers. January 28, 1975. Dawn breaks over Teaneck, New Jersey, like a judgment. The mansion sits quiet in the pre-morning darkness, every light off, every curtain drawn. Inside, Frank Lucas sleeps in silk sheets purchased with poison money, dreaming whatever dreams come to men who've built empires on the backs of addicts. Outside, 20 federal agents move into position with the silence of executioners. No sirens. No warnings. Just the battering ram against the front door and the sudden explosion of voices shouting commands that shatter the illusion of safety Frank had wrapped around himself like that chinchilla coat. The empire dies in approximately 4 minutes, they find. $584,000 in cash hidden throughout the house. Not in a safe, but everywhere, behind false walls, under floorboards, inside furniture, in shoeboxes, places Frank thought were clever, but were obvious to men who'd spent careers hunting money. The physical weight of a criminal enterprise measured in dirty paper, rubber-banded and stuffed into laundry bags like evidence of a life lived wrong. Frank Lucas, the self-proclaimed king of Harlem, is led away in handcuffs. The chinchilla coat stays in the closet. The orange jumpsuit doesn't care about mythology or status. In federal custody, everyone looks the same, small, scared, and suddenly very aware of how much time 70 years actually is. 70 years. The mathematics were brutal and non-negotiable. Multiple counts of drug trafficking, conspiracy, racketeering, tax evasion. The kind of numbers that meant dying in prison, becoming a ghost while still breathing, watching the world move on through bulletproof glass during visiting hours that would eventually stop coming altogether. In the criminal underworld, there's only one code that matters when the walls close in. You do the time. You never cooperate. You die silent. This isn't negotiable philosophy. This is the price of admission to a world where loyalty is the only currency that actually holds value. Bumpy Johnson would have taken 70 years to his grave before speaking a single name to law enforcement. The old kings understood that respect outlives freedom, that your word is the only thing that survives after your body fails. Frank Lucas looked at 70 years and made a different calculation entirely. He became a rat. The cooperation agreement wasn't some noble act of exposing corruption. Court records strip away the Hollywood gloss and reveal something much uglier. Frank didn't just inform on corrupt cops, the sanitized version that makes audiences feel morally comfortable. He opened the book on everyone. Italian mafia figures he'd once competed against, rival dealers who'd trusted him with information, former lieutenants who'd eaten at his table, street-level soldiers who thought loyalty would protect them, even members of his own family, the country boys from North Carolina who'd followed him north believing blood meant something. Names for years. Faces for years. Lives for years. He traded loyalty like loose change. Picture the courtroom scenes that followed. Frank in a tailored suit, looking smaller than the legend he'd built for himself, sitting in the witness box with federal prosecutors, guiding him through testimony that would destroy dozens of lives. His voice steady, his memory suddenly crystal clear about conversations, transactions, and criminal conspiracies. "Do you see anyone in this courtroom today that you recognize?" the prosecutor asks. Frank points. The defendant's face goes white. Another life enters the machinery of federal prosecution. Every finger is a bullet. Every answer is a funeral. The man who claimed loyalty was everything became the ultimate betrayer. His cooperation helped convict over 100 defendants. 100 lives destroyed because Frank Lucas decided that 70 years was too high a price for keeping his mouth shut. The philosophical tension is devastating in its completeness. Frank built his entire mythology on being Bumpy Johnson's prot, the student who learned honor and discipline from Harlem's most respected figure. Yet Bumpy would have died silent before cooperating with law enforcement. Frank violated every principle that honor represented, and he did it systematically, thoroughly, and without apparent hesitation. The irony achieved perfect, terrible symmetry. Frank Lucas had used Bumpy Johnson's name and mythology to legitimize his rise, positioning himself as the continuation of Harlem royalty. In the end, he destroyed the Harlem underworld more effectively than any police task force ever could, becoming the single most destructive force in the history of the neighborhood he claimed to rule. For his extraordinary cooperation, the legal term for betraying everyone you know, Frank's 70-year sentence shrank to time served plus lifetime parole. He walked out of federal prison in 1981 after serving only 5 years. 5 years for flooding a community with heroin. 5 years for an empire that killed thousands. A fraction of what his crimes deserved. The king of Harlem was now a ghost. Not the invisible kind that Bumpy Johnson had perfected, the powerful shadow that moved through the world untouched. Frank was the hunted kind, the kind that jumps at car doors slamming and checks restaurant exits before sitting down. He entered witness protection, living in fear, looking over his shoulder for the rest of his breathing days. He'd traded his throne for his life, loyalty for survival, respect for breathing. The streets moved on, New dealers rose. Blue magic became a memory. America forgot about Frank Lucas almost immediately, until Hollywood came calling with an offer to make him immortal. The rat was about to become a legend, and this time, the whole world would believe the lie. Obscurity is another kind of prison. No bars, no guards, just the suffocating silence of being forgotten. For decades after witness protection, Frank Lucas lived in that silence. The chinchilla coat hung in some evidence locker. The country boys had scattered back to North Carolina or federal prison. The front row seats at Madison Square Garden belonged to other men with other money. Frank was just another aging black man with bad knees and a damaged past, moving through the world unnoticed, anonymous, forgettable. But Frank Lucas understood something deeper than bricks and bullets, something more powerful than any kilo he ever moved across international borders. In America, the story is the real product, and he still had inventory to sell. Legends don't die, they just wait for the right storyteller. In the early 2000s, Frank emerged from the shadows like a man climbing out of his own grave. He approached journalists first, then authors, then eventually Hollywood itself. The story he sold wasn't confession, it was mythology. The honorable gangster who only hurt other criminals. The brilliant strategist who learned respect from Harlem's greatest king. The revolutionary businessman who happened to sell heroin but did it with intelligence rather than violence. He didn't mention the rat part. That got edited out of every pitch. Frank positioned himself as a salesman of redemption, sitting across from tape recorders and legal pads with the magnetic charisma that made people want to believe the lie. He polished each detail until it gleamed. The coffin smuggling became historical fact. The Bumpy Johnson mentorship became gospel. His cooperation with federal prosecutors became heroism disguised as moral complexity. The details shifted with every retelling, but the core mythology remained consistent. Frank Lucas was the black man who beat the Italian mafia at their own game, the chosen son who inherited Harlem's throne through wisdom rather than violence. Reality doesn't sell. Fantasy does. In 2007, Ridley Scott directed American Gangster, and Frank Lucas achieved something no amount of blue magic could have purchased: immortality. Denzel Washington, the most respected black actor of his generation, wore Frank's face on screens across the world. Russell Crowe played the noble detective who brought him down. The film grossed over $260 million worldwide, transforming a criminal who'd betrayed everyone he knew into a folk hero for a generation that didn't know better. Frank served as consultant, walking through sets that recreated his fabricated past, correcting details to ensure the mythology stayed intact. He watched actors perform scenes that never happened, Bumpy dying in his arms, whispering final instructions, noble decisions made in dim rooms, coffin deals negotiated in jungle heat. Every time the director called action, Frank's lie became heavier, more solid, more permanent. The movie portrayed him exactly as he'd always claimed to be. Bumpy's proc, the heir apparent, the disciplined Don who revolutionized the drug trade through intelligence and honor. It showed the coffin's smuggling as documented history. It transformed his empire into something almost noble, clean, efficient, strategic. They showed the bodies, but they also showed the houses, the suits, the respect. They turned a heroin dealer into Robin Hood with a chinchilla coat. But not everyone applauded in the darkness. In a modest Philadelphia apartment, Mame Johnson watched American Gangster and felt her husband's legacy being stolen frame by frame. She saw Frank Lucas, the driver who waited by the car, the hired help who was never invited to real meetings, being crowned as Bumpy's spiritual successor. She watched Denzel Washington portray a relationship that never existed, reciting lines about loyalty and family that Frank Lucas never understood. The philosophical battle was now complete. The loud man with the movie deal versus the silent widow with inconvenient facts. Mame didn't have a movie studio or $100 million budget. But she had the truth, and she decided to weaponize it. She published Harlem Godfather as a direct rebuttal to the Hollywood fantasy. With surgical precision, she dismantled Frank's mythology piece by piece. She revealed that Bumpy never trusted Frank with serious business, never considered him family, never anointed him as successor. Frank was a driver who occasionally ran errands, nothing more. When Bumpy died at Wells' restaurant, Frank wasn't in the room. The deathbed conversation never happened. The mentorship was complete fiction. "My husband built something real," Mame said in interviews, her hands folded like she was testifying in a court that would never convene. "Frank Lucas built a story on top of my husband's grave." But here's the brutal mathematics of American culture. The loud man with the movie deal beats the silent widow with facts every single time. Frank's version had Denzel Washington, a $70 million budget, and theatrical release in 3,000 theaters. Mame's version had a book most people never read and interviews that disappeared into the noise of celebrity gossip. Who controls history? Not the people who lived it, the people who sell it. The cost of Frank's mythology wasn't just historical inaccuracy, it was human devastation measured in generations. Thousands of young men watched American Gangster and saw a blueprint for success. They idolized a criminal who'd betrayed everyone who ever trusted him, but they missed that part entirely. They saw Denzel in that chinchilla coat and thought that's what power looked like. They saw wealth, respect, and the ability to beat the system at its own game. They missed the bodies. They missed the communities poisoned by heroin. They missed the families destroyed by addiction. They missed the mothers screaming in hospital hallways over sons who'd overdosed on 98% pure poison. They missed the ultimate betrayal of becoming a federal informant who traded loyalty for survival, pointing at former associates in courtrooms to shave years off his own sentence. They saw the throne. They didn't see that it was always empty, that the crown was always stolen, that the king was always a lie. Frank had proven something fundamental and ugly about American culture. The story you tell about yourself matters infinitely more than the life you actually lived. Legends aren't voted on by historians or the people who knew you, they're sold to the people who never met you. And with good lighting, a famous face, and a compelling arc, a rat can become a king. A driver can become a right-hand man, and a man who destroyed his own community can become an aspirational figure. The liar's immortality. Frank Lucas died on May 30, 2019, at the age of 88, famous, comfortable, and completely unrepentant. The obituaries called him a drug kingpin and the inspiration for American Gangster. They mentioned his cooperation with law enforcement in passing, framed as heroism rather than betrayal. They repeated the coffin story as documented fact. They described him as Bumpy Johnson's proc without question marks. He never publicly recanted his story about being Bumpy's right hand. Never admitted the coffin smuggling was fantasy. Never stood up and said, "I lied. I was just the driver." He took his mythology to the grave, trusting one final, brutal calculation: the loud man might die. But his story becomes immortal. Mame Johnson had died years earlier in 2009, still insisting that Frank Lucas was nothing more than a driver who stole a dead man's crown. Her book remains in print, still telling the truth to anyone willing to read it. But truth is a quiet voice in a world that rewards volume. And her facts were no match for his legend. The lie had won completely, permanently, and profitably. The final question. So here we sit with the ultimate philosophical dilemma. The question that echoes long after the credits roll and the mythology hardens into accepted history. Was Frank Lucas a criminal genius who learned power from Harlem's greatest king, Or was he just a driver who discovered that in America, the biggest lie wins if you tell it well enough, long enough, and with enough confidence? Frank proved they're not the same thing. He proved you can be a rat, a liar, and a man who destroyed his own community and still become immortal if you control the narrative. He sat in the front seat of that Lincoln Continental, listening to lessons he was never meant to inherit, and learned something Bumpy never intended to teach. The man who controls the story controls history. The silent man lives longest, but the loud man with the movie deal becomes a legend. Frank Lucas took Bumpy Johnson's throne without ever earning the right to sit in it. He built an empire on stolen mythology, betrayed everyone who trusted him, and then sold that betrayal as heroism to a culture that values entertainment over truth. And it worked. Perfectly. Completely. Permanently. So if you had the chance, if you could rewrite your past, transform yourself from nobody to legend, steal a crown you never earned, and make the world believe you deserved it, would you tell the truth? Or would you put on that chinchilla coat, walk into Madison Square Garden, and let the world believe whatever lie made you immortal? Frank Lucas made his choice. He chose the throne over truth, noise over silence, the lie over the life. And when he died, famous and unrepentant, he proved something Bumpy Johnson never wanted anyone to learn. Sometimes the biggest lie doesn't just win. It becomes history. The king is dead. Long live the liar. And the throne he stole? It's still sitting there, empty as it always was, waiting for the next man hungry enough to claim it with nothing but a good story and the audacity to make the world believe. Was it worth it? Only Frank knows. And he took that answer to the grave, buried under 50 years of mythology, leaving us to wonder, in the end, what's more valuable? The respect you earn, or the legend you leave behind? The silent man lives. The loud man dies. But the liar? The liar becomes immortal.